almost every single one of these presentations has had a point where it touched on the world of institutions, right? We remember with fusion power, the comment and question, say, by Peter Thiel there was, can this even be done in a for-profit manner? With, the biosecurity angle, it was an interesting case of a gap in institutions where something seemed to be no one's responsibility in particular. And I could go on and on. Also, the two keynotes are, I think, very appropriate. It's very interesting to think about how technology fundamentally is a social fact. What do I mean by this? I mean that the only technology we have is the technology we've been able to assimilate into our societies. Any technology that did not find a productive niche in either our social or economic life is a technology we usually don't sustain beyond the curiosity. The distinction here between invention and adoption is very notable, right? Many things are invented, few things are adopted or stabilized, few things are built upon, improved upon in like the grand sweeping arc of human history. Now, maybe we've had a bit more recently, and I have some thoughts about why. I won't be talking about those thoughts. I will be briefly presenting what institutions even are. I'll also briefly present my perspective on them, which is, this very specific concept of functional institutions. After that, I'll have a few brief questions, and then I'll actually go and talk about what I think are plausible bottlenecks in the study of institutions, and especially functional institutions, and we'll have hopefully much more of a lively debate. I think in conferences, I always like the Q&A section the best. Now, institutions are these kind of vague words. I feel they've become sort of a meme. 5 years ago when I talked about it in Silicon Valley, it was still kind of a fresh word. Now everyone talks about it. They don't necessarily have a strong meaning attached to it. A definition we could think of is that a society or organization funded for a purpose, like that's an institution. What might that be, right? That might be a university, a company, a nonprofit. Companies are, not necessarily for profit as well, etc. You might have a social club, and you might have things that are a little bit less legible. And because of that, I kind of like a more inclusive definition that I often use, which is that it's essentially a zone of coordination aimed towards some purpose. Now, the little line at the end that it's maintained by automated systems, what do I mean by an automated system here? Well, corporate bylaws and so on, social norms, company culture, all of these things, some of them more tangible, some less tangible. The key point that I try to convey with automation here is that not everything in an institution can be done through exercises of human agency. I don't know about what other people's experience is like, but I know, I have not quite a limited reserve of willpower. Willpower is a weird resource subjectively, but I certainly don't do everything agentically. I think functional defaults are very important. What do I mean by functional, right? Do I just mean this kind of serves a purpose? I think I'm going for something a little bit stronger. With functional institutions, I have an underlying, theory that the vast majority of organizations are actually these, shambling monstrosities that kind of basically fail to work, that are sort of imitating much, much more functional models, sometimes copies of copies of copies, and that there were essentially prototypes or several prototypes that introduced almost everything we think of in society. Right? It's important to understand that the idea of, going and doing business with strangers at some point seemed quite unusual, right? And even if we say, oh, doing business with friends, well, what do we mean by friends, right? Depending on your society, your cousins might be inherently or obviously more trustworthy than, someone you met and you connected discussing philosophy or theology or economics, or just you both saw the same opportunity, or were in fact very different from very different walks of life, had complementary interests. That's already a consequence of there being both, a higher trust society with a wider circle of trust than just the immediate family, but also there is a whole concept of what a business partnership is. I imagine if you went, to a tribal society, somewhere in Papua New Guinea, and you try to explain of like, let's get into business. The first question would be, what do you even mean by business? And today, when you compare even something as close as, say, German management business culture versus Silicon Valley business culture, they're not really compatible. They're not necessarily that close. I guess I should explain why this picture comes to mind. I think the university in particular is a institution and a set of organizations that I often critique quite harshly. But I have to admit, it's plausibly one of the most brilliant inventions in social technology. It is by far the longest lived set of organizations that exist in the world, right? Oxford University, its founding predates the rise of the Aztec Empire, and I don't know, it seems to have outlasted the Aztec Empire. Few organizations outlast civilizations, even short-lived civilizations. And, its origin in medieval Europe is so different from the social and economic conditions today, yet it persists. And not only does it persists occupying several very important niches, like especially in Europe, a little bit less in the US, occupying law and medicine and controlling credentialing of law and medicine is a non-trivial, it's a non-trivial position. It's a position where lots of other organizations would like to have a say, would like to have a share of the pie, would like to fight you for those resources. Then also is the immeasurable contribution to human knowledge that the universities such as Oxford and the Sorbonne and so on contributed. The point about imitation, I hope, should be obvious. I don't know if people here know about this, but Cambridge, Massachusetts, that town was renamed to Cambridge after the school was set up there. Like, talk about trying to steal someone's fame, right? And there are several Oxfords and Cambridges all over the Anglosphere. Everyone wanted to imitate those few original organizations. Just in the case of Harvard, that brand became strong enough you didn't have to pretend to be Cambridge anymore, right? There are interesting things that I could continue to say about this, but I really think that for this presentation and for the time limits we have, it's best to think of a functional institution as this institution that has really outsized effects. And you find this over and over again. You compare the very top company with a typical company, right? There's a nice power law distribution on almost any metric you might choose. The same is, again, I would say true of universities. The same is true of organized religion, right? The planet's largest organized religion is quite a bit bigger than the second biggest organized religion, and so on. So this is true also in terms of state power. This is true of, again, it shows over and over and over again. And maybe it's, just a consequence of power laws, or maybe it's a consequence of this sort of prototyping and imitation hypothesis that I sketched out, where most organizations, they sort of half succeed in copying the functional original machine, and everyone else is sort of building a cargo cult bamboo version of the particular institutional airplane. The obvious examples that come to mind for people here is like things like the Apollo project and so on, where one thing that I think is not emphasized enough is that not only is there a complex set of contracting structures that allowed NASA to meet the relevant deadlines, not only was there an unusual calculus where, on the one hand, say, scientists were trying to get funded, trying to get real scientific work done, and say, the Kennedys, the Nixons, and, Johnsons of the world were sort of pressuring them to give them a legible win, something that's visible to the public. But also, the internal organization of it, it's kind of bizarrely militaristic. If you watch, maybe a documentary I could recommend is, I think it's called Apollo 11. It's a documentary made completely out of stock imagery. If you look at the way the people hold themselves, right, or if you read any interviews or if you read any accounts, you realize, okay, these are World War II era American social organizational norms applied to a nominally civilian context. And I say a nominal civilian context because, if you could interview each of the people in that control room, how many of them do you think genuinely and deeply cared about getting to the moon before the Soviets? I think easily the answer is enough, right? The answer is enough. You often can have this mission focus helps drive an organization towards a particular outcome. There are other things I could say about this concept, about the features that I explore in some of my writing, features that are explored in many literatures actually, of what makes for a functional institution. First off, this basic observation that some institutions are more productive than others, but then there's also this interesting question of how do they come into being? And here I have what again, perhaps is not that controversial a statement in this room, but if you take it seriously enough, it really starts to refactor the way you view the world. It's, the view that such complex machinery does not arise simply out of chance or evolution, but is the product of design, partially because you see these immense jumps in organizational and social complexity, that there's like a founder origin. Another interesting one is that institutions reliably decay over time, and I'm going to briefly touch on why. But there are in fact several reasons that they do. This is not obvious. You could imagine creating institutions and, like the university system, though we can critique it, they persist, maybe perpetually. That would be a very different social world. It actually requires explanations why a design, once implemented and built in, out of the material of human beings, why that, decays, fails, falls off its mission, and so on. Another interesting point is that as a consequence, it's necessary to refound or reform institutions periodically. The question of founding was something I touched on earlier. Sometimes organizations have, in their very inception, built in a date of obsolescence, a point after which they change the world so much that they're no longer needed, viable, or perhaps their entire project was always folly. I'm relatively morally neutral in my analysis, right? When I call something a functional institution, I'm not saying it's necessarily good. And, this sort of question of what is folly, what is ambition? It's always an interesting and tricky one. The states of decay are ones that we have in our cultural memory. It's very interesting that in the Western world, we tend to have a very linear view of history. We tend to have a relatively progressive view of history. But despite this, we have this very cultural awareness of sort of the blip of the Roman Empire. And I think that plays an important, psychological, mythological, and other role. We use concepts all the time that basically tell like a set of simple morality plays as to why organizations decay. Sometimes these are helpful, right? The view that, infighting, office politicking, and so on is a very important driver of dissolution. I think that's a valid insight. The view that, say, wealth in itself causes problems, well, there's some truth to it, but I think it's greatly exaggerated. I think people like the decadence hypothesis much too much, right? They will say, oh, it was inevitable Google would start doing slightly less interesting things because it got so much money and so on. There are good counterexamples of this. The refounding aspect of organizations and institutions applies at all levels. If circumstances change, especially technological circumstances, you might have to rethink rather significant things about your society and about technology in your society. The Meiji Restoration in the 19th century is an interesting example where you have an essentially feudal society that at one point chose, and quite consciously chose, to abolish the use of firearms just a few centuries earlier, where firearm-based warfare helps unify the country, helps produce a state reform that moves it away from a more unstable feudalism to a more stable feudalism. And of course, the exposure to the United States with a superior technological base results in some revisions to the society, right? And there are societies that fail this, and Japan is interesting because it succeeds in reimagining itself. But this reimagining, it went step by step. It went through, again, a conscious effort to learn how Western militaries work, up to the point of adopting Western-style militaries and military uniforms and drills, things that might seem purely aesthetic or arbitrary choices. Additionally, there's also the question of why does Japan develop slightly differently financially and so on? It doesn't have any of the institutions of a 17th century Netherlands or a 19th century America, and it quite consciously tries to recreate some of these functions. When you look at the reform of a whole society, I would say you clearly are looking at the reform of a set of institutions, one after another, a set of large organizations at times, and at other times the introduction of new archetypes and prototypes of organizations, where you have many, many examples of them, right? You might have a Western-style corporation. Now, at this point, I am open for, let's say, 2 questions just on the topic of functional institutions before I go on to talk about why, how we can study this, who studies this already. There's in fact a lot of good work and so on. I also, if you're like me, then I know you had good intentions with the reading list, but it'll be left as an exercise for the future. So let me again recommend the small points that I added here. In particular, I think people might be interested in the Apollo program, sort of the patronage structure analysis, and my own writing on functional institutions, right? So not all of these are written by me. Some of them are by Ben Landor-Taylor and other interesting authors. Oh, what is the most functional institution today? I feel like that is a good question. But I wanted to say it's a bad question. I had to correct myself. Well, I would say it's very hard for me to evaluate. I don't necessarily feel qualified, but I will say that there are a number of highly functional institutions, right? I would say that, for all its flaws, when it comes to R&D, America actually has a bunch to recommend it. I actually think DARPA still does a very good job. This isn't a contrarian take, but I think it's an accurate one. I have to say that when it comes to, say, city politics, we could discuss what exactly is and isn't functional. I would highlight, rather than the usual favorite of Singapore, I would highlight perhaps Tokyo as a particularly well-run city. And it is one of the world's largest cities. It has good infrastructure, and also, it builds unlike San Francisco. So thank you. And
in your definition of a functional institution, you go for the outcome. So you say institutions that successfully reshape the world in service of their purpose. And if you were instead to look at the process or the sort of internal workings of the institution to create a different definition of functional institution, what dynamics or processes internally would you point to, assuming you could not look at their outcomes?
Okay. I sketched out a few of them earlier, and I could say a few more. Like I tend to think that creators of organizations should really shepherd them until it's a mature prototype, even if that involves some intermediate failure and experimentation. I tend to think that human judgment outperforms excessively automated systems. I tend to think that when it comes to transmission of knowledge, one-on-one work is best. If you can emulate something like a master-apprentice relationship, that works particularly well because of the alignment of relevant incentives and the transfer of tacit knowledge. I raise many more of these points in some of my essays, so I'm happy to go into that a bit further. Okay, one more question.
Why is Oxford such a functional institution? I mean, I went there and like everything I've experienced just seems like counter. I mean, it does persist, but I have like no explanation for why.
Well, I think one important thing is you should realize is perhaps if there was, no Oxford, no Sorbonne, and so on, like a rather middle of the road normal academic experience just wouldn't exist. I think there's certainly possibilities of having societies with really different institutions of higher learning or no institution of higher learning. it possibly doesn't live up to its reputation, because the reputation is a product of many, many centuries of accumulation, right? To use a different example again, Harvard and Yale, right? They start building their reputations as divinity schools, proving Jesus exists. And of course now, many people, in the early 2000s made their intellectual careers by going around being like, Jesus doesn't exist. The interesting part about this is you can completely change the rationale for the prestige, legitimacy, reputation of an organization if the reputation transfers. It's kind of bizarre, right? We could easily imagine that we had social intuitions where it's sort of like, where if an organization changed its purpose, you would kind of lose respect for it and you would just treat it as a completely new thing. We see this sometimes with political revolutions as well, where state authorities built up on the process and the basis of divine right, and then instead of kind of resetting or setting to whatever philosophical set point would be correct for popular sovereignty, it kind of picks up where the absolute monarchy left off in the case of France, and continues building it up slowly or losing it, with military defeats and victories and so on. And I think the last question. There was someone there. Yes.
You might know the answer to this. Has someone done like keystone mapping, like an ecological complexity analysis? Because one of the things I'm thinking about is so often, like I've been to a couple of your talks, right? We talk about institutions on an individual level. And I think if we were talking about the institution of science, the institution of research, if that's not a keystone institution in our society and our keystone institutions collapse, it seems problematic. So it's just sort of,
Right. I think the ecological perspective on society is a very useful analogy. It's not exactly right, but I do think institutions are deeply interdependent. I think almost every functional institution is subsidized by every other functional institution in ways that are hard to detect. Economists have like decent ways of trying to estimate the positive externalities of particular companies. There are ways in which, I think there's an invisible subsidy that persists in modern Silicon Valley from Stanford and Berkeley, where a number of my VC friends when they moved to Miami, I think they neglected to look at the infrastructure that might bring companies there. The infrastructure being a very good university where you can draw technical talent from. Technical talent is not quite as fungible as some funding theses would like to propose. Again, Stanford has its flaws, but I think it does a really good job of subsidizing the Bay Area, and it's, of course, subsidized in turn. I don't think that a comprehensive analysis of sort of the foundational organizations of our society has really been done, and it's a very difficult undertaking, right? It's something that would be hard to split up to a team of people, even though it would take a team of people, because fundamental philosophical assumptions would be so different. Ideally, you could do an analysis where you separate is from ought, but in practice, especially, the bigger picture you go, the more macro you're thinking about society, the more these values seep in what you see and don't see, and which methods you pick. Study of institutions. I hope I've established that it would be interesting to look at institutions. This is not just pure generalism. This is looking at human organizations, at what people do together, right? There are, of course, people that, again, already do this. I want to emphasize it. But the insights remain significantly fractured across many, many different fields. There's something interesting where, a nonprofit of 50 people can be oddly similar to a for-profit of 50 people, or a company of 10,000 or 50,000 people can start to resemble a government bureau of 10 or 50,000 people. There's a bizarre similarity about these modes of human organization, and we have people with very different competencies, very different methods who study them, and I think in a way lack a good framework to talk about them. In a way, functional institutions is, I think, a coherent area of study that is pre-paradigmatic. It's less developed than many of the others, or many of what we might expect should be obvious avenues of research. Now, the fragmentation of knowledge is perhaps primarily a consequence of significant specialization in our society. the argument that, oh, we're very specialized, we can't correlate all our knowledge, but it's quite different to say that there is no space for a generalist, or that there is not a clear niche for a generalist. And it's quite different to say that a specific niche, right, a specific nook in this library of Babel, this sort of infinite library, is unfilled and could be developed partially from borrowing from the other ones and partially just through revising what we can observe. Basically, there's a whole lot of fields that touch on it but don't focus on it. The first one is anthropology. I think one of the most important methods from anthropology is field work. Field work is where you basically go, you embed yourself with either a tribe or an organization, you observe them, and you record your observations from participating in their society. This has flaws, but it also has strengths. Every time you think you are making, say, an argument about how humanity has changed over time or about how Stone Age life was, you should realize that epistemically, you're standing on nothing more than the field work of some 1930s and 40s anthropologists who visited these areas, right? Often I think we dismiss anecdotal evidence, we dismiss this type of field work, but we happily use the fruit of such work, right? And even rely on it significantly. There are areas that perhaps were, seem like they would have detailed institutional analyses. You would think that historians, when someone writes a history of the university system, they might also study the history of libraries, or at least a summary of the history of libraries or something like this. But then that seldomly happens. There's no sort of standard way to approach an institutional analysis and learning from its history. It's very, idiosyncratic in how historians approach these. There's this sort of set of journals that focus on something called management science, which is itself trying to be an integration of a few fields that I think are a bit more real, which is various aspects of management, some aspects of PR work, of marketing. It might sound odd to talk about marketing and PR work as methods of studying society and institutions, but obviously they are. Part of your job is to position your own organization or your client's organization with regard to the rest of society. If you're effective at it, clearly you know something about your organization and about the rest of society, even if you don't write an academic paper about it. And that's part of what I want to emphasize here. The body of knowledge that can be drawn upon, that could be integrated into a coherent literature, isn't just pillaging the other libraries, right? It involves doing completely different practical kind of field work. One of the areas of insight where I think we actually learned a whole lot is the culture of startups in Silicon Valley. I think we, as a civilization and as a society, learned new things about very, very small teams working together very, very closely to do something that isn't always understood by others in society. I think we gained a new archetype in a new way of approaching things. As big a change as, say, the introduction of military ranks and drill would have been in Meiji Restoration Japan. So, the people who work with startups, I think, have things to contribute, have relevant thinking on this. Sociology, I think, is a field that has kind of a bad reputation, and I would argue for the same reason that philosophy sometimes has a bad reputation. If you're a successful philosopher, you're often reclassified as something other than a philosopher. And if you are a good 1890s or 1900s or 1920s or even 1950s sociologist, you might end up being reclassified as an economist in later history. Political theory and political science are obvious candidates here, and in a way they're the ones that got the most attention. I think they got the most attention in a way that perhaps caused people to believe that government is more exceptional and different and unique in terms of how we should think about human organizations. But I think often the best way to think of government institutions is that they are just very similar entities to all the other ones we might see. But still, political theory, political science, do have important insight about organizations at different scales. We could go further. We could mention progress studies as, I think, a new field that has come into being. But I think that's something others should present on. I'm going to touch on economics because it's such a rich family of fields that I think just mentioning and recommending some authors here might be useful. Of course, there are other presentations on economics. I think there's some excellent, world-class experts on this field and this set of fields in this room. But I always found particular value in the so-called historical school of economics. Weber, Schumpeter, public choice economics has deep insights. Institutional economics, where you can be provocative and sort of count Marx in that class. I certainly think Marx and Veblen are worth reading. New institutional economics is actually one field that, when I first started reading the literature, I was hopeful would be touching on all of these aspects, but actually ended up not talking about all of the institutional aspects that I think it should. Still, the theory of the firm is a significant contribution to our thinking about human organization. Now, fragmentation can happen over time as well, where I think the data set we have of all of human history and all of the organizational structures that have been tried is actually one that we continuously lose. It takes a lot of work to try to reconstruct 17th century prices. It takes a lot of work to reconstruct what the actual political arrangements were of the Roman Republic at a certain period of its time. And there are some things we will never know. There's a constant struggle against entropy in a way that I feel is harder to address than some of the hard sciences. In a very real sense, the physics of the universe remain available to us, and we can run new experiments. It's much harder to run new experiments in human organization, but we can do it. And this data set, if you have a decay of organizations, these organizations will lose their institutional memory. And if you try to store this institutional memory in some other institution, well, how good a library is Oxford? I don't think Oxford, even if it studied back in the day, the politics and the law of its era really preserved the politics or law of the 16th century as something that we can truly understand, can truly rely on. The text behind me, by the way, is the one preserved case study of deep political work from the ancient era. It's Aristotle's Constitution of Athens, constitution in the descriptive rather than prescriptive sense, where he sort of just looked at Athens and tried to figure out how it works. There were about 100 case studies of this type done by Aristotle and his students before he wrote about political theory. I hope that's a nice example of a lost data set. And often this is what I think about when I review the work of contemporary scholars. Say when I look at Peter Turchin's work, I sort of ask myself, so what's actually going to happen to your data sets once you stop working on them? Will they be picked up? Will they be expanded? Will people build on the analysis? Will they sort of get lost? I'm going to now talk about some interesting things about, what does a successful science of institutions actually do? Well, I think one of the very basic problems is Goodhearts Law, right? Goodhearts Law is the observation that when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. Any science of institutions will and should be used to, say, guide the development of organizations, to help tell people, well, okay, here, this is a functional institution, this is not a functional institution, here's how you can improve your odds, and so on. But the dynamic here is one of either self-exhaustion or a self-fulfilling prophecy. The self-exhaustion is your insights, your observations are correct, everyone applies them, they're no longer really a competitive advantage, they don't even describe the new generation of organizations that well. The other one is, your description might have not been true originally, but as people take it to be true and reorganize the internal structure of their organizations, well, now it's an accurate observation. And the severe epistemic problem here is the imagination of what could be and testing of really different hypotheses about society. This is like a little bit more fun. I think we live in an era where there's a little bit of dearth of social thinking as well. So even though I think as a society we're quite ready and there's an exciting and interesting niche to be had for the study of institutions, there's so much that we could learn by, comparing these very different types of human organization. They're in a way more legible than they've ever been. We have in a way just far more organizations in the world now than we ever have, but we do surprisingly little thinking about them. And I think part of the reason we do surprisingly little thinking about them is that there is an eagerness to achieve results, sometimes to achieve results much too early. My favorite example of this is a 16th century Ottoman observatory set up in Istanbul in the Tower of Galata. It's contemporary to Tycho's observations in Denmark. And, the astronomer there is fairly confident that, he can accurately chart the travel of a particular comet. The Sultan Murad III is enthusiastic, supports his work for a good 3 years. They chart the celestial body, how it goes through the sky. They produce a good astrological chart. The astrological chart suggests that, the conquest of Persia is imminent. This is wonderful news. Unfortunately, there's an outbreak of disease and several important people die in accidents. So that's the end of astronomical observations in Istanbul. At the time, astronomical observations mostly funded themselves via astrology. Almost any sort of hero in the development of astronomy you can think of probably, made their way by calculating astrological charts. There's an interesting question always of, well, is what you are researching tied in any real way to the reason why people materially support you or not? And also, if you are overpromising these immediate early results, can you really do that at the start of a field? I think it's a hard sell. There's also the question of, why does thinking about society feel dangerous, or why is it aggressively boring? Why is thinking about your immediate circumstances sometimes aggressively boring? I suspect the reason is just a type of cowardice, where we are in fact very afraid of social disapproval or even of political persecution. And historically, this fear has been fairly rational. Currently, I think we live in a surprisingly tolerant society, but there is still real danger in that, and I think it kind of stops people from investigating things one step further, right? Investigating things in a way that suggests any kind of serious social reform. Another interesting question is, what does the relative prestige and interest of fields do for their successes or their failures? I'm curious, does anyone recognize the recipient of the prize? Yeah, this is a much less famous example than I think Oppenheimer would be. But I think that there's a very relevant and important aspect to this. It's the economist, this is wobbly, Jan Tinberg. He's receiving here, together with another economist, Ragnar Frisch, the first Nobel Prize in Economics, 1969. That's relatively recent compared to the origin of the other Nobel Prizes. And economics has done by far the best job of both producing something that is usable within our society, be it a self-fulfilling prophecy, a noble lie, or a genuinely good observation, and secondly, legitimizing itself as significant, a field that should attract top thinkers. And I think that's kind of an underlying reason why the usual set of methodologies has done so well. The ability of a field to attract talent, mostly through essentially these kind of prestige mechanisms, is perhaps more important for thinkers than purely economic incentives, ironically. Another interesting example is Edward Bernays, someone who went from marketing to political theory in what I think is a personally very interesting study of an intellectual career. You start with Freudian psychology, you go to marketing products, and then the products you market, you not only write about your own marketing efforts and how powerful they are and how good a job they did of transforming society, you end up suggesting that this is a significant component of democracy and that the lessons we could learn from marketing should be advanced by a new science and a new field of study and practice of political propaganda. He imagined this would lead to a more rational society, a society where basically people who knew better could speak to the public at large. I think the track record of propaganda is more mixed. If we were doing this presentation 2 or 3 years ago, I would cite public health campaigns, say against smoking, and public health in general as a very positive application of this body of knowledge. In this year, it's hard to say whether we would have been better off or not with such knowledge. Finally, there's again, honorable mention to, I think, a historian that does history right, Carol Quigley, who does dive into the details of a whole number of organizations. Again, his macro analysis of civilization is perhaps lacking, but he does a very good job in the 1960s and so on of being literate in many, many different ways, like of understanding some aspects of economics, some aspects of political theory, relying on primary sources, trying to interact with people, and finally also teaching some interesting people. It might not be known here, but he was the intellectual mentor of Bill Clinton. And, things are always a little bit overdetermined in people's life choices. But I will say, Bill Clinton's general approach to politics and his approach to, say, networking, building, these connected scenes of people pretty much matches Carol Quigley's theories of elites and elite formation and elite transformation. So the challenge I would give everyone here is to consider whether you yourself have notable or interesting observations about society, and not just society, much more specifically, a concrete institution you know very well. And are these insights that are perhaps not obvious to others? If that's the case, I really do encourage you to speak about it, to write about it, but I also encourage you to start reading and thinking and conversing with others about their own experience in their institutions. The most productive aspect of organizational growth often comes from this hybridization and cross-pollination, and yes, when appropriate, imitation. Okay, thank you. This is the question section.
I'm thinking about, in some sense, you talked about the strengths of institutions in terms of their survivability and sort of persistence power. And then on a different dimension, it felt like we were talking about sort of the strength of the soul of the institution from a functional, perspective. And I guess what I'm wondering is who, if anyone, actually measures and tracks that, and how for institutions today?
The soul of an institution? Mm-hmm. That's a very good question. I don't know.
What measures do we have? You see companies or even universities, and the question is the question you asked: how many people in this institution are aligned on an objective function and really committed to it in a personal way? Right? There's an indicator of that, and yet I find myself wondering, how is it measured? How do we evaluate it? Who does that, if anyone? And do we even care?
Do you feel that if you walked into a room or saw them at work, you would know? You personally?
Yes.
Well, okay, interesting. Then maybe the answer is you. Maybe you should pursue a career in investments if the soul of a company is relevant. But I think that there is something we can see just by observing. I think we sometimes underestimate these sort of very mammalian instincts we have. Human sociality is very, very old. We've been a social species for basically several million years at this point. Small group collaboration is something we've developed some interesting intuitions. Some of it's cultural legacy, I'm sure, but some of it's quite ingrained. And there's a way in which I think that the very best observers of the souls of institutions have what's described as a very, very educated intuition, right? So like an educated guess isn't the right term. It's sort of like an educated understanding of what your gut feeling is telling you, together with other facts. Cool. I think just one more question, maybe.
So it seems like there's a very strong economic and otherwise incentive for a lot of different people to study institutions. Like the people designing the institutions themselves have a sort of extreme interest in the success of their institution, frequently in
so they claim.
Well, at least the ones who are building them are putting in a lot of effort. And so my question is, how many institution founders study how functional institutions work, and if a very small number do, why? And if a large number do, then why don't we learn from them?
Yeah, I think I was taking that as implicit, that it would be obviously valuable to understand how to make institutions that change the world, that last for a very long time. But I think part of it is a learned helplessness. There's a belief that there is no subject of study. There's nothing really to learn. There's only my immediate circumstances. And, I'm just doing what every other reasonable person does. But, the thought experiment should be revealing that doing what every other reasonable person does is often very much determined by our social environment and by the sort of views that we have in society. I think the reason they don't study it, despite the massive economic incentive, is that they don't know how. They sometimes don't believe there is something that can be known. And also, finally, I think that they're vaguely terrified of maybe I'll get wrong answers about how the world works, socially wrong, not epistemically wrong. It's much, much better to sort of be able to, honestly believe that you work at a remarkable company than to maybe correctly identify that it's a failing company or a stagnating company, right? It's personally troubling.
It kind of seems like a functional institution is something that persists for a very long time. But it also seems like maybe some institutions should have specific timelines. You mentioned this briefly, right? So let's take FAST grants versus the NIH. They both funded a bunch of research. Which one is more functional? One certainly funded a bunch of research much faster than the other one. But was the purpose to fund a bunch of COVID research fast? Is it entirely successful there and should shut down versus like taking over a different niche? So I guess I'm just asking, how do you think about both the outcome and the sort of sustainability of the institution in terms of defining functional?
It depends on what you're trying to do with it, right? If you're trying to preserve, the sum total of human knowledge, then maybe longevity is a good idea, because otherwise, any mathematics proofs that you make will be completely obscure or irrelevant or improperly indexed just a few centuries later. And, we do occasionally lose mathematics, right? So often I am very delighted when a mathematician says that they're seeking immortality. And then I ask them, well, how many ancient Greek mathematicians do you know? If they're good, they actually understand the immense debt modern mathematics has to Euclid. We were still mining insights out of Euclid's basically introductory textbooks in the 19th century. So yeah, for some things you want very long-lived organizations, and for others, I don't think that's the case, especially since in some places the decay function is much, much faster. It's no surprise that the political theories that Western civilization likes to rely on imply that there should be significant reform. It's also interesting to interrogate, say, the concept of a revolution. When that concept is introduced into political discourse, a revolution is supposed to end up where it starts. It's supposed to be a refresh, right? It's supposed to be a recreation. It's not supposed to be just a tearing down. And this goes out of older political theories of the Greek world, where political types of government cycle in a very predictable way. So I think the answer is yeah, planned obsolescence is good, especially if the organization achieves its objective during the course of its life. Some things only need to be done once. Arguably, say, building the Suez Canal or building the Panama Canal was clearly something that was very much worthwhile, only needed to be done once. A comparably interesting example might be China's Jin Dynasty creating the Grand Canal, which connects the Yellow River to the Yangtze River. If you want some equivalent of a space elevator economically, something that transformed human history, a single piece of infrastructure, I'd argue it's that piece of infrastructure. It enables the colonization of the Yangtze River Valley by the Yellow River civilization. There's a massive amount of trade between the two areas. There's a massive amount of prosperity. However, the Jin Dynasty kind of bankrupts itself trying to make it. Was that a foolish dynasty? Was that a bad dynasty? I mean, was that a functional dynasty? I think in some ways, clearly it wasn't functional, but I have to say, completing such a project, I think it's quite worth it if they consider themselves heirs and building towards a larger Chinese civilization rather than just their own particular dynasty. They took the correct course of action for the long run, not the short run, even though they were a short-lived dynasty, like I think 60 or 70 years only. Cool.